Christianity is built off of one claim, that the incarnation of God himself entered into history, was despised by the world at the time he came, and was executed by the authorities of his day, and raised himself from the dead in order to prove his claims which he has established, that he is the Son of the living God. When one begins examining the core beliefs of other religions, Christianity is an undeniably odd situation where the religious claim to truth is not built off of a revelation given to a prophet or attributed to some sacred writing or core teaching as it would be with Buddhism, Islam, or other religions, but is built off of a single historical event that was witnessed by the public. In fact, this isn't just a theme present in the resurrection, but in the whole life of Christ, in which he does public miracles and teachings, so the wider populace may see his truth manifest physically. The fact answers to an intrinsic attribute of the human person, to seek motives of credibility that show that the claims one is making are not just extraordinary claims, but true reflections of an extraordinary nature. This accuracy pertaining to human nature is most especially present in the Christian faith. Humans want to see evidence for their beliefs, or what they seek to believe in. However, it is Christianity that manifests itself in the best kind of evidence possible: physical, tangible miracles. Miracles are seated at the core of the Christian life, and is the only religion that claims this many consistent miracles that not only tell us that there is a God, but a God that is still working and active in our world to this day. The Christian God is not a dead God who produces no results, but is living and breathing to this very moment. With the advent of modern science, the Church can make use of secular scientific organizations to examine miracle claims with scrutiny to show whether something truly is physically impossible without divine intervention, or if it is a false claim, which the Church is humble enough to admit that in some cases the party claiming the miracle either had a misunderstanding or is just straight lying. Yes, we can show miracles exist using these gifts, but how do we apply the same level of scrutiny to know that the resurrection happened? The central claim of the Christian truth. The resurrection was a historical event, so we can't go back in time to see what happened at the tomb in Jerusalem. Thus, we must apply the same standard of scrutiny that historians would apply to any ancient text to see if it's authentic. In order to know that the resurrection was a real event, beyond any reasonable doubt, we must examine multiple forms of historical criteria to decipher whether the New Testament accounts are truly eyewitness testimony, that they accurately describe the events without contradiction, that they are written within the living memory of the events so that there's no time for the legend to fully surface. We must also examine the counter-arguments against the reliability of the accounts to see how they hold up to the evidence. And finally, we will see what explanation best explains the spread of early Christianity and other factors. The New Testament contains 4 Gospels, biographies of the life of Christ that are consistent with biographical practices and standards for the time in which it was written. However, because these are multiple accounts of the same event, we have to corroborate all the claims together into one narrative to see how everything fits together and really see if there is genuine discrepancy between these resurrection accounts. Firstly, and principally, we must note that no gospel provides a complete account of the events, which is not something we should be scared of, but we should actually like because it supports the Christian position. As the gospel writer Luke says in his introduction, these are corroborated from eyewitness testimony. Thus, not every eyewitness or source is going to have the same information. They're going to recognize different details based on who the person is and how they saw the events. The Gospels contain undesigned coincidences, which is a common attribute of multiple attestation from eyewitnesses. Essentially, one Gospel will describe a certain detail about the resurrection that fills in an empty gap that isn't explained in another account, but unifies the narrative more clearly. This doesn't show marks of mythological writing, but of objective historical attestation to a real event. Now that we've clarified that, let's map out the resurrection account chronologically. Early Sunday morning, a group of women who include Mary Magdalene, a disciple of Christ, and Mary the mother of James, Salome, and Joanna venture to the tomb of Christ to anoint his body with spices, which is consistent with the burial practices of the time. An earthquake had happened and an angel had rolled the stone away from the tomb. However, this stone had been rolled away before the women arrived at the tomb. After arriving at the site of the tomb around dawn, they see that the stone has been moved from the tomb, and Mary Magdalene, under the assumption that someone stole the body, ran to Jerusalem from where the women came from to tell Peter and John. The women who stay at the tomb while Mary is going to speak to Peter and John see angels that appear to them who tell them that Jesus has been raised from the dead and tells them to inform the apostles about the resurrection. This is also odd for a first-century biography in an age where the testimony of women was legally declared invalid. This meets the historical criterion of embarrassment because the 12 apostles, all men, ran away hiding in fear, while it was the women who were loyal and visited Jesus. Thus, after the angel instructs them to tell the apostles, they flee to go do this. So after Mary Magdalene announces that Christ has been raised, Peter and John run from Jerusalem to the tomb mid-morning. John arrives first to the tomb, a detail only found in John's Gospel. Way to toot your own horn, John. However, John arrives at the tomb first, but waits and lets Peter enter first, and John enters shortly behind him. So they enter the tomb to find the linen cloth of Jesus lying folded and empty, but there's no body and no angels at the tomb any longer. They return to their houses, very weirded out about the whole situation. In the late morning hours, Mary Magdalene had followed far behind Peter and John back to the tomb and stayed at the tomb to weep after Peter and John leave. She looks back inside the tomb and sees two angels and then turns around and sees Jesus. The first appearance of his resurrected body is to a woman, not a man. As a matter of fact, so far it has only been the women who have seen the angels and the miraculous deeds, and not the male apostles. Yet another odd detail that you wouldn't expect in a fabricated account, especially because of the standing of women during that time, and the fact that you would want to lie to make yourself look better if you're writing pure mythology. Thus, after she sees Jesus, Jesus tells her to go tell the brethren about his rising. During this, the other women who were at the tomb are going to the disciples, and Jesus appears to them on the road. In the afternoon, Jesus had appeared to Peter privately, which is not mentioned specifically in the Gospels, but is confirmed by Paul. After this appearance, Jesus appears to two disciples on the road to Emmaus. However, at first they don't recognize that it's Jesus immediately. He explains the scriptures to them about the coming of the Messiah and reveals his identity to them in the breaking of the bread. On that Sunday evening, the disciples head back to Jerusalem to tell the others about the resurrection, and while they're speaking, Jesus appears in a room they're in that's locked. He eats in front of them and presents his wounds to prove that he has been physically raised and isn't just some ghost. 1 week after Easter Sunday, Jesus appears to the disciples again. The last time he appeared to them in the upper room, the apostle Thomas wasn't with them, but now that he is, Jesus shows Thomas, who doubts that Christ is raised, his wounds. This is another curious detail. The fact that there were still disciples who doubted, even after seeing the resurrected body and even the ascension, is such a realistic and honest detail. If this was fiction, you would want to tell people that everyone believed in the miracles in order to better convince people to hop on the bandwagon and make them feel stupid for not chiming in on this Christian business. After the appearance to Thomas, Jesus appears to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and later to a wide group of disciples to deliver the Great Commission, to go in all the world and spread the gospel to all the nations to fulfill the Old Testament prophecy of the conversion of the nations, which, well, I'd say was pretty darn fulfilled. That is the entire resurrection account of Jesus Christ. However, let's take a look at a table that gives us insight on how the Gospels distribute this information. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's Gospel all contain the women visiting the tomb to anoint Jesus' body. However, only John's Gospel has the detail of Mary running to Peter and John to tell them about the resurrection. This is evidently because John was a direct eyewitness to this event, and the other apostles likely never got this information from other eyewitnesses or written accounts. The angels declaring Jesus has been raised to the women disciples is present across all 4 Gospel accounts as well. All of the Gospels have this very embarrassing detail. Sheesh. To write something down like this in the cultural context of the time, I'd be clenching my teeth very strongly, having to admit that the men were too wimpy to even look at the tomb. Peter and John visiting the tomb is only present in Luke and John's gospel. John doesn't surprise me because, well, he was there personally, and Luke was a follower of Paul, who was close to the apostles Peter, James, and John. And Luke had already been corroborating information for his account for a very long time, as he tells Theophilus in the beginning of his gospel. It doesn't surprise me that Luke, the very historically inclined apostle, would have this information as well. Jesus' first appearance to Mary is only present in Mark and John's gospel. Jesus appearing to the female disciples is only present in Matthew's gospel. And Jesus appearing to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus is only found in Mark and Luke's gospel. So are the appearances in the upper room. And the last appearances in Galilee are only mentioned by Matthew and John. So what does this tell us? Well, that the authors, much like other ancient biographers of their age, were not attempting to write a complete and exhaustive history, but trying to emphasize certain elements of the account to convey deeper truths. However, the great thing is that we have multiple accounts, and we can transpose them all together to get a unified account of the same event that gives us a good sign that this was corroborated information. However, let's look at some counter-arguments against the reliability of the accounts, which are usually found in arguments that say the accounts contradict one another. Firstly, we need to understand a very key point here, that omission of certain events does not mean the apostles disagree that they ever happened or that the accounts contradict. Many critics will argue that John's gospel says that only Mary was at the tomb, not the other female disciples, while Matthew also mentions two Marys and Mark mentions a Salome who was with them. This is not a contradiction in the slightest. When we're analyzing texts like these, we have to understand that an account that only explains a partial part of the female party does not mean that it denies there were ever other people there. Yes, John's gospel only mentions Mary's perspective, but never says Mary had gone alone. As a matter of fact, in John 20, verse 2, Mary herself says, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." There's a plural pronoun in use that shows John's focus on Mary's perspective was not a denial that there were other women at the tomb. Another thing we need to clarify is that in order to show that the Gospels contradict logically, you have to prove that two statements cannot be true at the same time. Some will argue that Matthew and Mark's Gospel mention only one angel speaking to the women, while Luke and John say there were two angels at the tomb. The first problem is Matthew never says there was only one angel. There were two angels present, but only one spoke. Matthew and Mark record this clearly, but Luke and John gives us the full picture that while they were talking to this principal angel, there was another angel present. No contradiction here. A co-founder of Harvard Law School, Simon Greenleaf, had done a strict legal analysis on the gospel accounts themselves and came to a similar conclusion. If four witnesses were to give perfectly identical and matching testimonies of a single event with no variations, then that would be extremely suspicious to the judge, and he would rightly suspect that they are fabricating a false story. Every authentic eyewitness testimony contains variations because, well, different people notice different aspects of an event. The Gospels unanimously agree on the same core. Jesus was crucified, his tomb was found empty, he appeared to them in a physical body, and had genuinely transformed them from scared people to people who were genuinely ready to give up their life in extremely grotesque ways for the truth of Christianity. These slight variations in detail actually prove to us that these are eyewitness accounts and strengthen the reliability, showing that they are corroborating this independent of one another. Genuinely imagine being in their shoes. You just watched your teacher get scourged and crucified in front of thousands of people, and he's just walking around eating fish with his wound still present. This is going to cause profound cognitive dissonance. It's exactly why certain gospels emphasize certain details, because depending on how each person is affected, they're going to focus on different things. These also align with how witnesses of crimes or even other Christian miracles that happen in real life record these events. Another alleged gospel contradiction is the timing of the events. John says that Mary Magdalene had gotten to the tomb when it was around dark, while Mark said they arrived when the sun had risen. However, this makes complete sense. The women were staying in Jerusalem, around Bethany to be exact. It would be a 2-mile walk for them up to the tomb of Christ, which was outside the walls of Jerusalem. They would have initially set out when it was dark to avoid the Roman curfews, gathered their spices, and walked, and had finally arrived when the sun was now rising on the horizon. This is consistent with how an ancient writer would have explained time, not based on the literal atomic sense, but on the observation of the sky. They're just describing the early morning darkness to the sunset. Thus, the women had departed from Jerusalem while it was still darker and had finally arrived at the tomb when the sun was rising. No issue here. Another common issue is whether the angels were inside the tomb or outside the tomb. Matthew describes an angel sitting outside of the tomb. Mark describes an angel sitting inside of the tomb. Luke describes 2 angels standing inside, while John describes 2 angels sitting inside as well. However, these are different descriptions of different events in the chronology, not contradicting explanations of the same exact instance. The angel rolls away the stone and sits on it, but in Matthew 28:6, the angel says, "Come, see the place where he lay," and the angel leads them inside the tomb. The writers are simply just focusing on different moments of the same event. Again, this strengthens the reliability more than breaks it. Another apparent discrepancy is the women's reaction. In the Gospel of Mark it says, "And they went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." While the other Gospels describe the women running with great joy and telling the disciples. This is not problematic at all when you realize that Mark is just describing their immediate reaction. They're still very much in shock at first while running through the streets. They wouldn't have stopped to chat with passers-by and were terrified until they reached the disciples, who they knew they could trust. Another apparent contradiction is geographical. Luke seems to place the resurrection appearances in Jerusalem specifically, and the disciples all stay in the city of Jerusalem, while in Matthew and Mark's gospel they emphasize the disciples going to Galilee to see Jesus, not Jerusalem. This is, again, more evidence that the gospel is an ancient biography rather than a fictional account, because ancient biographies often utilized a method known as telescoping, in which a long period of time is shortened into one single narrative flow without explaining any time jumps explicitly. Luke is simply just compressing the timeline in his gospel, yet we know Luke agrees and knows about the time gap because he literally writes about it in the book of Acts, which he authored and states, "He presented himself alive to them after his suffering by many proofs, appearing to them during the 40 days. Also, these appearances took place for around 6 weeks. Jesus had appeared in Jerusalem for the first 8 days of the resurrection to Mary Magdalene, the disciples going to Emmaus, and to Peter and the 12. Henceforth, the disciples traveled to the home country of Galilee as they were instructed to by Jesus, and Jesus had physically met them at the sea and the mountain. Afterwards, they returned back to Jerusalem for Pentecost, just in time to witness Jesus' ascension from the Mount of Olives. Again, the more we examine these counter-arguments, the more the Christian position is actually strengthened rather than weakened, which is a pretty good sign so far. The next counter-argument is an apparent mathematical contradiction, which surprises me because the Jews were really good with math and numbers, so that would be a shame if the skeptics are correct with this one, which, unfortunately, they're definitely not. In Matthew 12:40, Jesus prophesies that he will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, like how Jonah was in the belly of a whale. Yet Jesus had been crucified on a Friday afternoon and rose before dawn on Sunday, which is 36 hours. It's 3 days, but only 2 nights, which makes Jesus look as if he failed his own prophecy on account of just bad counting. Yet this completely disregards the cultural context of how the ancient Jews counted time. They didn't count it in the same way we count time now. The Jews utilized a system of time called inclusive reckoning, in which any part of the day was counted as a whole period of day and night. Jesus was dead for a part of the 3rd day and night, which the ancients would have counted as a full day. It's weird, but it's another example of God just working with the ancient standards of the time to bring the fulfillment of his divine plan. Another apparent issue is Jesus telling Mary Magdalene in John 20:17 not to touch him or not to cling to him because he has not yet ascended to the Father. Yet literally in Matthew 28:9 it says the other women took hold of his feet and worshipped him, even after Jesus invites Thomas to touch his wounds. Is this some kind of double standard, or did something change? No. In John 20:17, looking at the Greek it was originally written in, Jesus says, me mu haptu. This is a present imperative. It basically communicates a command that is fixated on a continuous action rather than a single event. It commands how an action should be performed over a specific lapse of time. Essentially, Jesus is saying, stop doing the thing that you are currently doing to me. Thus, Jesus was not saying, don't touch my body at all, ever. He was saying, stop clinging to me in this current moment. Mary was probably clinging to him or something, scared that he would leave them behind again. But Jesus is trying to say that you can't just hold me here because I still have other things to do. So please go tell the others about what happened, just like I instructed. Another apparent oddity is when the stone at the tomb had been rolled away, Mark, Luke, and John state that when the women had arrived, the stone had already been rolled away. Matthew 28:2, on the other hand, states, and behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came back and rolled the stone and sat on it. People will say that Matthew is implying the women arrived, and then the earthquake and stone rolled in front of them, not that it had happened before the fact. However, this is something that may be more difficult to see in the English translation, but in the original Greek, the solution is much clearer. The verb being used for the angel descending and the stone rolling back is what we would call an aorist participle. It's basically describing an event that took place in the past without explaining how it is in relation with the current timeline. Matthew is explaining why the stone had been shifted away and the guards were terrified when the women had arrived. It can be translated perfectly as, now there had been a great earthquake, etc., etc. Matthew still uses the past tense in the English translation, but it might be a bit harder to catch. Again, really good thing we have multiple accounts to figure out what this Matthew guy really means here. One of the most interesting counter-arguments that really helps us gain a better understanding of the theology and nature of Jesus' bodily resurrection is the fact that in Luke 24:39, Jesus says, a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have. And then he eats some fish to prove that he has resurrected in a physical body. Pretty cool. However, this is problematic when you look at 1 Corinthians 15:44. Paul says the resurrected body is spiritual and that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Thus, the counter-argument is trying to show that Luke faked the idea of a physical resurrection, but Paul believed in a purely spiritual one that isn't physical, and it creates this contradiction situation, kind of. Well, really not. The word Paul uses for spiritual in Greek, pneumatikos, does not mean that you are some ghostly invisible body. If we're looking at the ancient Greek theological usage of terms, an adjective that would end in ikos would explain what directs an object and not the anatomical makeup of the object itself. The objection also fundamentally misunderstands what Paul is even talking about here. In verses where Paul is contrasting a natural body with a spiritual body, he's trying to explain the difference between a physical body driven by a biological system that will die to a body that is driven by the Holy Spirit, which never dies. Also, when Paul states that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom, the term he is using, flesh and blood, was a common term used by the Jews to just describe a mortal, corruptible nature, as we can see in verses like Galatians 1:16, not literal physical bodily anatomy. Both Luke and Paul agree completely that when we resurrect, we have a physical body, but are just transformed to be immortal and incorruptible. Those are all the major discrepancy counter-arguments that we're going to look at for now. There are probably more out there, but you can probably debunk them the same way that I did. Well, you will, using the Greek and utilizing the other Gospels to show how these attest to one another. So it should be pretty easy to get rid of these objections. Now we're going to look in depth on why it is most likely, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the resurrection happened and is historical fact. To do this, we're going to utilize all facts that scholars, religious and atheists alike, agree upon and use those to show that the resurrection is the only possible explanation to fully fulfill all of the agreed upon historical facts. So I'm essentially using the minimal facts argument, but I'm going to do some little things here that are kind of fun with it, and you'll see. Firstly, we do have to note the seriousness of the resurrection in the Christian faith. As Paul himself says, if there is no resurrection, our faith is in vain. This is the whole claim of Christianity, a public resurrection with hundreds of eyewitnesses that occurred for 40 days. I suppose the first reason that it's very difficult to explain away the resurrection with purely naturalistic explanations is the fact that Christianity even spread at all. Think about it. What kind of self-respecting person would want to willingly believe that some impoverished Jewish rabbi who was humiliatingly beaten, spat on, mocked, and made a fool of in front of thousands, who was crucified completely naked and died, was God or divinely ordained? I mean, genuinely, how would you convince people to follow, let alone change their moral conduct and give up their whole lives in martyrdom for something like this very early on? It's understandable for Islam and other religions, but not Christianity. It would genuinely be more miraculous for this religion to spread at the speed that it did without any miracles than it would be for people to see literal miracles then convert. If you're going to get people to follow this religion, you need to do some extraordinary things. But even then, the Bible itself admits that people still didn't believe, even after witnessing all these things. If people won't even believe when the evidence is right in front of them, how do you think they would take it without any at all? Just blind and incredibly easy to refute claims of a mythological resurrection that could literally be disproven in seconds? Because again, this religion is incredibly easy to falsify if this never happened. I mean, come on. A crucified person rises from the dead and appears to hundreds across a wide area for 40 days. This religion should have never spread if it was a lie. Furthermore, what kind of self-respecting religious Christian leader writing the Gospels would want to risk a mass deconversion and embarrassing rebuttal and deconstruction of his entire religion by hinging the entire reliability of this faith on multiple public miracles witnessed by thousands in multiple different areas that are mentioned by name, and a 40-day resurrection event that hundreds witnessed? If these things never happen, this would be the equivalent of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head for this entire faith. Persecutions began incredibly early in the church's life, and within the living memory of those who could have witnessed the resurrection. But even then, Christianity could have been dismantled the day the claim was made that Christ was risen from the dead. No one is going to stay loyal to a faith like this through horrific and cruel persecutions without some pretty damn good evidence to stay loyal to it. Sorry for my little nerd out theological rant there, but let's get into the historical arguments for the resurrection. Here is what nearly universally all scholars believe is factual about the origins of Christianity. Jesus died by crucifixion. This is confirmed by all four Gospels, the Roman historian Tacitus, the Jewish historian Josephus, and the Talmud. With the utter humiliation of a crucified founder, and well, literally God himself, we have probably the most proper criterion of embarrassment, historically speaking. It is extremely unlikely the Jews would invent a movement that is built off of the humiliating public execution of a convicted criminal. The apostles sincerely believed they saw the resurrected Christ and went to martyrdom on account of these claims. We see this universally in early Christian testimonies, especially the one from Pliny the Younger to the Emperor Trajan. We see it in the Church Fathers, and also in the Book of Acts, the apostles and the disciples' willingness to endure suffering, extreme torture, and death for this. It's true that people die for lies all the time, but nobody would ever die for a lie that they invented or they know is false. The transformation of cowards to martyrs is an undeniable fact. The conversion of Saul of Tarsus, who would be renamed Paul by Jesus. Pretty nifty, huh? Paul's own letters show this, which scholars don't disagree with, and Acts is pretty consistent and reliable in describing his sudden conversion. He was a Pharisee and persecutor of Christians, eventually becoming the persecuted himself, and he endured it willingly. He hated the church and would have no desire to see this church grow. Something insane would have to have shifted this view so suddenly. The conversion of James, the brother of Jesus. Josephus records James, the brother of Jesus' execution, and the Gospels show that Jesus' close friends or distant family like James did not believe in him during his public ministry. However, James would go on to become the bishop of the church in Jerusalem and would die a martyr's death. The resurrection was proclaimed very early, shortly after the initial events. The empty tomb. Most scholars, around 75%, agree the tomb was empty because, well, the body was still there, the authorities could have easily produced it and showed it to everyone, immediately destroying the Christian movement. Christianity spread extremely fast after the initial events. These are all the facts that nearly every single scholar agrees on, but how do they show us that the resurrection is the most likely catalyst for these historical facts? Well, firstly, let's look at some natural explanations for the resurrection. Firstly is the swoon theory, which claims that Jesus didn't die on the cross, but he was just passed out, was buried alive, and woke up and presented himself to the disciples. This was utterly refuted medically in 1986 when the Journal of the American Medical Association had released a peer-reviewed medical study on how Jesus died. Their conclusions, based on the biblical descriptions of the intense scourging and crucifixion which would cause asphyxiation, Jesus would have most definitely been dead prior to the spear piercing his side, which releases blood and water. Also, another issue is the fact that a scourged and crucified man who has nails driven into his nerves, likely putting parts of his hand in partial paralysis, like we see on the Shroud of Turin, with the thumbs snapping into the hands. Because when you drive a nail through destot space like they would have done historically, this would paralyze the nerve endings and cause the victim to be unable to properly use their hands after the fact. This theory would have us believe that Jesus could roll his tomb aside and escape from fully armored Roman soldiers guarding the tomb, and would not be able to do much physically to escape these men. If he didn't die in the tomb, he probably would have died shortly after his escape, no doubt. The second is the stolen body hypothesis, but this one is automatically unlikely because it's mentioned in the Gospels by the conspiring Jews who are trying to refute the event themselves. I find it extremely unlikely that a fabricator would place the means by which they lied to the whole world about the resurrection just in the Gospel all willy-nilly. You wouldn't want to risk anyone finding out the truth. Furthermore, the disciples were beaten, imprisoned, constantly under threat by opposition, and executed for their claims to Jesus' resurrection. If they had stolen the body, they would know it was a hoax and not have gotten themselves martyred for something they themselves made up. Just human nature in general shows that someone's gonna break and confess everything to escape death on an upside-down cross or being fed to lions. But also, religiously speaking, the Jews in the first century did not believe or have a concept of a historical event in which the Messiah would die and rise again physically. Their idea of resurrection was at the end of time and would happen for all people who were faithful and followed the commandments of God. It wouldn't communicate well at all with Jews, or let alone anyone. And even if Jews believed this, they still wouldn't think it was a crucified guy who was just a teacher who did no miracles, if we are to believe the skeptical standpoint. A third counter-argument is that they were just looking at the wrong tomb. This makes sense if you completely disregard the verse that the disciples themselves escorted Jesus to his tomb. Anyway, it argues that the women who were just blinded by confusion and panic went to the wrong tomb and saw it was empty and just assumed resurrection. Then they went and told the apostles who believed them. I have many issues with this. Firstly, nobody's gonna jump to a resurrection, especially with a scenario of some humiliatingly crucified, not so very miraculous Jewish preacher. They're going to point to a stolen body, and even then, if they went to the wrong tomb and began preaching his resurrection, the Roman authorities who seek order and the Jewish authorities who seek religious consistency would point everyone to the right tomb and automatically discredit Christianity completely and give it no reason to spread. Furthermore, Jesus was not buried in some rink-a-dink random tomb, but the tomb of a prominent Sanhedrin member, Joseph of Arimathea, the very council that ruled Jesus should be executed. This location would be known to the higher authorities, and again, they could easily parade the body through the streets and show people that they were just looking at the wrong tomb, and boom, no Christianity. The fourth counter-argument is the hallucination hypothesis. So basically, the disciples were in shock and under great mental duress from the brutalities they had just witnessed, and experienced hallucinations of Jesus, leading them to believe he had risen. This is currently one of the most popular naturalistic explanations of the resurrection among skeptics. However, it suffers from a fundamental issue that hallucinations are individual events that happen internally, and that it's almost impossible that 12 or let alone 500 people could have the exact hallucination of the same thing at the same time. These appearances happened at multiple locations, to different people at different times of day. The disciples physically touched his wounds and ate and drank with him and had genuine conversations with him. An even bigger problem is that even if they are hallucinating, hallucinations don't steal bodies from their tombs. If they are really hallucinating, the body of Jesus would most likely still be in the tomb, and the leaders at the time could walk down and show everyone, guys, calm down, he's in the tomb. But even if his body is missing or stolen by fanatics and the apostles didn't know, people don't have mass hallucinations, and the people seeing the apostles preaching this message can easily debunk these claims as just a bunch of crazy, methed up disciples who have no sense of reality right now and would literally make the movement even less appealing to follow, as if it wasn't already not appealing to follow. Also, personal note for my guilty conscience, whenever I make criticisms like that of the Christian movement, they're not my own personal convictions, but based on the historical and cultural context of the time, is just probably what other people's thoughts would be. I'm not saying I would personally think those things, but I don't know. I didn't live in the first century, okay? This one falls hand in hand with the hallucination hypothesis. This one is the cognitive dissonance theory. Basically, in the 1950s, Leon Festinger had studied this UFO cult that had prophesied that the world would end. However, this prophecy failed, but instead of admitting they just made it up, they actually doubled down on the claims to cope with the other failure. Thus, critics say that this is what the disciples did when Jesus died. They just invented a victory to cope with the very brutal humiliation of the cross. Again, this is a huge problem when considering that no one else is willingly going to believe this coping mechanism from the disciples. When the UFO cult's spaceship prophecy didn't happen, they didn't claim a physical victory, that they had physically come in contact with the aliens, but it was purely spiritual. They argued that the aliens spared Earth from annihilation because of how faithful their cult was to them. Thus, if these disciples were experiencing the same dissonance, they would have claimed a spiritual victory that couldn't be falsified by empirical evidence, but they argued a physical death and resurrection that happened for 40 days witnessed by hundreds of people. Also, it would hardly be a coping mechanism for the disciples to do such a thing with the risk of persecution and suffering. If you are to expect that this dissonance will sustain itself amongst the apostles, you have to have them living in comfortable conditions, but they weren't at all and willingly endured suffering and death, which wouldn't give them any comfort in their coping mechanisms and gave them no relief when they were only getting beatings, fear, suffering, imprisonment, and death because of their claims. Thus, this coping mechanism, this cognitive dissonance thing, it wouldn't last at all. The fifth argument is the scavenger hypothesis, popularized by critical scholar Dr. John Dominic Crossan. Let's give Dr. Crossan a clap, first of all, for willingly enduring the eternal punishment of getting a PhD just to have doctor added to his name. Bravo, Vince. His claim is that the story of Joseph of Arimathea putting Jesus in the tomb is a myth, when it was actually the standard Roman procedure to just leave crucified criminals on the cross to rot or throw their remains in a pit for dogs to eat. So Jesus was never in the tomb to begin with, therefore it's just all BS. This makes confirming a bodily resurrection much more difficult, because now you don't even have the license of an empty tomb. In its place, you've got an empty claim that has no evidence and that really nobody's going to be convinced of without some really good reasons, let's be honest. The argument is flawed because it ignores the first century Roman law and the Jewish evidence regarding how crucifixion was handled in a time of peace like Pax Romana when Jesus lived. If you look at the Digesta of Justinian, which is essentially a compendium of literally centuries of Roman law, including first century ones, yawn, states, "The bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused their relatives." Furthermore, the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria had confirmed that Romans would often grant this mercy to Jews in Judea to avoid violating Jewish religious laws, which makes sense because, well, Jerusalem is right there and it's kind of the center of all that stuff, so yeah. Also, Josephus wrote on this same topic in the first century in his War of the Jews. The Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down. Finally, 1968 archaeological excavations in Jerusalem had discovered an ossuary of a man named Yehohanan. The box contained his heel bone with a nail driven through it. He wasn't thrown in some pit, but was buried in a tomb traditionally. The next, and honestly my favorite counter-argument because it would make for an extremely hilarious comedy movie, is the twin brother hypothesis, which was popularized by philosopher Greg Calvin, which asserts that Jesus had an identical twin brother who had been separated at birth, or maybe they schemed together for this whole thing, I don't know. But this twin brother either coincidentally or planned to arrive in Jerusalem on Sunday morning and realize his own brother had been killed and was this crazy popular Jewish preacher. Thus, he decided to act like him and act as if he was resurrected to vindicate his brother's teachings and fool the disciples. Now, I love this counter-argument, because it would genuinely be the craziest thing if a whole religion practiced by millions and billions was just some twin brother fooling with people. It's a shame that it doesn't make any sense at all. Firstly, this twin, whether he met Jesus or not, would have to have the exact same voice, mannerism, and theological genius and philosophies to fool these guys who had literally lived in close contact with Jesus for 3 years straight. Also, this twin brother is going to have to willingly have some guy mutilate his own back with a flagrum, pierce his own hands and feet with nails, and a side wound. However, most concerningly, the brother would be willingly doing the same thing his brother did in the same city where the local government just executed him. He would not risk his own neck willingly to start some religion that might never gain any traction in the first place. Also, you're telling me that nobody could see this guy and just say that they know it's his identical twin brother, because to be an identical twin of someone would probably make you quite well known in that small area, and people would already know that this guy isn't Jesus, but just his twin brother, maybe. I don't know, maybe that's a stretch. Finally, the one you've all been waiting for, the legend hypothesis. That Jesus was a historical figure who really got crucified, but over time, the story of the resurrection was just invented to get people to convert to Christianity. It was just kind of a game of telephone that got garbled over time, or maybe it just developed immediately by some fabricators. But this doesn't make any sense at all in light of the evidence we have. The fundamental issue is that, well, for a legend to develop, you need time. The problem is that scholars agree that Paul's epistles and the Gospels were written within the historical living memory of people who could have witnessed this happen. Furthermore, a lot of what they're receiving to write these things down, as Luke says in the introduction of his Gospel, is eyewitness testimony and transmission of oral tradition, as Paul says as well in 1 Corinthians. You gotta have these witnesses die before making these kinds of embellishments to a real event. At the latest, in the skeptical view, the accounts were written 70 years after the event, which is still way too early to make these legendary assertions that wipe out brute historical fact. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3 through 7, describes a very early Christian creed detailing the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and even details appearances to his disciples and to the hundreds after his resurrection. Now, scholars trace this within 2 years after the resurrection. Imagine that nowadays. Taylor Swift dies, and then some of her crazy fanatics try to say that she's resurrected just 2 years, 20 years, no matter how long after. You would have so many people available to completely demolish this claim because, again, it's built off of literally the most easy to prove false claim in human history. A 10-year-old could tear this whole thing down. Another massive problem is that, well, the Gospels are not in any way written like mythology, and are written exactly like and considered by the majority of scholars to be reflective of genuine Greco-Roman biographical standards, based on their historical genre clues, language, structure, and wording of the events they describe. C.S. Lewis, a pretty unknown Oxford scholar who wrote some pretty obscure books, who spent his entire life studying ancient mythology as an atheist, only to be converted by the Lord of the Rings dude, is very strong on the point that the Gospels in no way read like ancient mythology but actual events. The protagonists are not heroic or strong, glorified images who show their prowess. They're cowardly and flawed disciples who fail and betray their teacher, especially Peter, the chief apostle who could have easily earned the death penalty in his time. I mean, betraying your Lord in that way would have been so embarrassing, insane, and most of all dangerous to admit in that time. Furthermore, the Gospels are anchored in real history with extremely accurate geography, practices, political dramas in the Judean court at that time, the peculiar and murderous Pontius Pilate, and the events have also been supported by historians like Josephus and Tacitus. The issue with mythology is it usually takes place once upon a time, with some mythologized version of real places which is completely void of real historical reference. A major issue also is the women. They're the primary witnesses to the resurrection in a culture that is completely patriarchal. If you're trying to get people to believe this happened, you are most certainly not going to say that the women were the ones who passed this down to us. Meanwhile, in mythology, women are, a lot of the times, on the not-so-favorable side of the equation, and much more so in the cultures in which these mythologies were written in. And they're kind of just seen as servants of the awesome dudes who do all the cool heroic stuff. Another problem with the legend hypothesis is the geography of it all. Myths usually develop far away from the original setting place of where the events happen so that locals can't fact-check anything. Christianity, however, first got big in Jerusalem, which, what do you know, is where the resurrection happened, and makes sense that it would explode and spread so fast because, well, this really happened, and people were telling everyone, and they were all going insane over all this. It isn't what we'd expect for something that never happened or is just some claim made by a bunch of preachers. You also have to remember that none of the early Christian skeptics ever argued that what they made up was legendary completely, or that Jesus never did miracles. The Talmud calls Jesus a necromancer and sorcerer, and Celsus, one of the earliest Christian skeptics, if not the earliest, public Christian skeptic who wrote against it, never says that Jesus' miracles were completely made up, but mostly complains about the nature of his miracles. Tacitus doesn't deny it, Josephus doesn't deny it. Some of the Testimonium Flavianum, Josephus' testimony of Jesus' life, might have been a later Christian interpolation, but the part about him doing wondrous deeds likely is part of the original texts. Also, the Jewish argument against Christianity wasn't that they were completely mythologizing everything, but Matthew 28 and Justin Martyr's accounts was that the main argument was that the disciples stole the body. You don't need some counter story to the resurrection if the tomb isn't even empty in the first place. Another major issue also is that, well, if you want people to believe in the resurrection, you would want to write it up to make it seem like an undeniable and universally agreed upon fact by those who witnessed it. But again, the Bible makes it clear that a lot of people witnessed the risen Jesus and still didn't believe, which signals to me that this is an accurate account rather than a complete legendary fabrication designed to get people to join up with this religion. If we are to assume that this resurrection never happened, then we are left with a very mysterious puzzle piece that cannot be filled by any other argument. The insane spread of Christianity by unarmed preachers with just their claims. Well, they did miracles to spread this further, but if you're an atheist, you're just gonna say they made claims. This spread goes far beyond what we've seen with any religion in history. This in and of itself is miraculous just based on the extremely humiliating and dishonorable nature of the origin of this religion. Deuteronomy 21:23 states that if you were crucified, you were cursed by God. We know Jesus was crucified and would be the complete proof to any Jew in Jerusalem where it first spread that he most certainly was not anyone with divine knowledge, but a false prophet cursed by God. Jesus, rather than contradicting the scripture, fulfills it because he took the greatest curse upon himself the day he was born, our humanity and our sins. Paul specifically celebrates this as a profound proof of Jesus' love for us, and compares this law with Jesus taking on the greatest curse of all. We also have records of other failed Jewish claimants to messiahhood from that same era, confirmed by Josephus and the scriptures, like Judas the Galilean, Theudas, Simon Bar Kokhba, who would always be crushed by the Romans, but the followers were never able to convince people after their deaths that they were legit. They either just went back home or picked a new leader who was a family member of the original claimant. The fact that so many Jews accepted the radical redefinition of what the Messiah even was almost overnight would almost certainly have to be aided with some kind of miracle or extraordinary deed, because you couldn't convince any slightly self-respecting Jew during this time that this humble man was Messiah rather than a warlord as many of the traditions taught. This almost certainly happened. Now, remember all those counter-arguments I just listed? Well, now we're going to use the brute historical facts that all scholars agree on to show that the resurrection can be the only sufficient explanation for all the facts. Now, some might counter-argue that using the scholarly consensus is a fallacy known as an appeal to popularity, and they argue that historical truth isn't determined by what scholars find appealing, and that these scholars can be biased. First of all, I'm not done with all my evidence, and also, this isn't an appeal to popularity, but establishes a common ground for interfaith communication by using data that is accepted. And as I formally explained, it isn't data that they're just pulling from their asses, but they're using real data points that are reliable and meet the criteria of reliability. Even then, people are still going to go like the David Hume approach and say that even if the evidence of a miracle is strong, a naturalist explanation, no matter how inconceivable it may be, is always much more infinitely likely than miracles that can't happen at all. However, this assumes too much. It's a presupposition based on a specific worldview, naturalism, rather than arguing from a historical viewpoint. We can know that the God of classical theism is the true God based on the fact that we know scientifically the universe had a beginning, and that space, time, and matter all came into reality at one single point. And because these didn't exist before the beginning of the universe, it logically follows that the Creator is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, which is how theologians have always thought about the God of classical theism for centuries. Thus, if you accept the possibility that there is a God, just a possibility, you don't even have to fully believe, then a miracle is no longer a mere impossibility, and it actually becomes a question of evidence. Also, because of the amount of scientific studies undertaken to investigate real miraculous claims like Eucharistic miracles, the Shroud of Turin, the Tilma of Guadalupe, Padre Pio's stigmata, Padre Pio's healings, the healings at Lourdes, etc., these studies show that these things can't have any naturalistic explanations that check off all the boxes of the oddities with these instances. We should genuinely try and consider the possibility of miracles, because there are many scientific and reliable proponents that push the reality of these Christian charisms. So I beg you, try to be a little open-minded. As a former atheist, I was able to, and you can too. I understand it's difficult to open your mind to something that's contradictory to your own beliefs. I totally get that. But please, I invite you to just examine these things, and if you're genuinely not convinced, then that's totally fine. Again, here are the core historical facts most scholars agree upon and have the best data for. Jesus died by crucifixion. The apostles sincerely believed they saw the resurrected Christ and went to martyrdom on account of these things. Christianity spread extremely fast. Paul converted, James converted, the resurrection was proclaimed very early, shortly after the initial events, and that there was an empty tomb. Let's firstly look at the swoon counter-argument. So the claim is that Jesus didn't die on the cross, but fainted and later revived in a tomb. Now this perfectly explains the apostles' experience of seeing a living Jesus, and they probably would have sincerely believed it, but it wouldn't really inspire any proclamation of a real resurrection and would show that this Messiah had not conquered death, but death is definitely conquering him because he is not going to be alive outside of that tomb for long with the damage he endured. And also, this contradicts the fact that Jesus definitely died by crucifixion and completely disregards how effective the Romans were at killing. It doesn't meet the proper criteria for a fast spread where people are truly going to go out of their way and tell everyone, because this is not some heroic resurrection, but a dying man who is powerless and in need of medical attention, hardly a conquest of death. It only meets really one of the criteria, that the apostles believe they saw this, but besides that, other criteria are not going to be met in a proper fashion. Next is the hallucination theory. Now again, this explains the sincere belief, but hallucinations are individual experiences, and they wouldn't be seen by James or Paul. For a hallucination of that kind to happen, you would have to be expecting, in a very delusional way, for Jesus to rise again, which the Jews didn't believe, and the fact that the apostles ran and hid after his death shows that they definitely weren't expecting nor awaiting this fact at all either. This explains an early proclamation, but people would find the apostles to not be right in the head if this guy obviously died and they're preaching that he's walking around and, well, he's nowhere to be found whatsoever. Again, this only meets one of the criteria historically. The stolen body theory explains the empty tomb, but the apostles would not have sincerely believed this, nor would Paul and James be converted because, well, there's no miracle and no reason that they should from a naturalistic standpoint here. This might explain an early proclamation, but no one is going to take real heed to this without real evidence. It also doesn't explain the extremely fast spread of Christianity. People aren't going to automatically give up their lives and leave the Jewish chosen people club just to follow a crucified Jewish Messiah who is nowhere to be found and his tomb is empty and is allegedly walking around. It will just go in the books as another failed messianic claimant whose followers keep trying to drag it on with rumors, kind of like Ninja with the low taper fade meme. Okay, I'll stop. It only meets one of the criteria, though, historically. This one isn't... none of them are sufficient. For the wrong tomb theory, it supports none of the facts, except for maybe crucifixion. But since there's no sincere belief that's possible because, well, Jesus is still dead and the authorities could easily reproduce the body and completely end the movement once and for all, this doesn't really meet any criteria. Now, the pure legend theory also doesn't really meet any of the criteria. The legend doesn't have time to develop because the writings of the resurrection are made within the living memory of the events. The Creed in Corinthians was made within 2 years of the resurrection, and it also fails to explain the martyrdom of the apostles. It also has trouble explaining the fast spread because, well, if there's absolutely no reason to believe this legend that takes a lot of sacrifice and a lot of strength to put your faith in without evidence, and people aren't going to abandon and change all these things for this messianic claimant. This doesn't meet any of the criteria. The twin brother hypothesis doesn't really meet any of the criteria because anyone could easily figure out that this is Jesus' twin brother, and it's extremely doubtful that this brother would reproduce the words and learn all the theological intricacies of Jesus, replicate his mannerisms perfectly just to likely get crucified again by the Romans. He's not going to risk his neck to do that. The only thing that can meet all these facts perfectly is a bodily resurrection. None of these boxes can be checked all the way by naturalistic arguments. The Jews in the first century wanted the Messiah to be a victorious military and political leader, which is why many of the messianic claimants of the time appealed to militaristic language against the Romans to help usher more passionate followers who were tired of Roman tyranny. To the Jews, and really to the world, Jesus was defeated, beaten, tortured, mocked, and executed by the very enemy the Messiah was supposed to take down, Rome. And Paul himself wrote that this fact was a stumbling block to the Jews, and this even deeply troubled Gentiles. But despite this, the religion still spread like wildfire, no matter what suffering or what humiliation the religion was founded in and would eventually cause for its followers. Furthermore, to the Greeks and Romans, crucifixion was the worst and lowest of human degradation that one could ever experience and was reserved for the lowest in society. It was designed to extend suffering and rob someone of every single shred of dignity and personhood. Furthermore, the Greeks believed the body was a prison, and a physical resurrection would have been insulting and disgusting to them. This is especially prevalent in Acts 17, when Paul encounters the evil Epicurean and Stoic philosophers of his day. People are not going to invent a religion that is this repulsive to a target audience. It's self-suicide, and to build the whole religion based off these massive claims that can be toppled in seconds? It completely disregards all the major demographics they want to convert. This ultimately shows me that this isn't invented, but just the way things are. Only something like an objective event, like the resurrection, could coax the early Christians to preach such a repulsive message to people and willingly endure suffering and death for it. Epistemologically, people don't come to believe in extremely countercultural beliefs like this based on blind claims. For any community to shift their ways to this kind of worldview, there must be sufficient evidence. Maybe Jesus allowing the apostles to do miracles wasn't such a bad idea after all when we consider this fact. People need good evidence. Look at the apostles. They go from these cowards to willing martyrs who proclaimed his resurrection in this very same city he was crucified in. Humans might die for a lie they mistakenly believe is true, but they never die for a claim that they know is made up, and anyone living in the Jerusalem area or the apostles would have most certainly known that this insane claim of a resurrected dead Jewish preacher walking around for 40 days and appearing to 500 people is almost certainly impossible, yet they all died and willingly were eaten by lions for their belief. This is the non-Christian dilemma. You need so many acrobatics and hoops to jump through to explain this in a purely naturalistic way, but either way you make it look like a miracle. You can't avoid making this look like a miracle. It is impossible it could have happened purely naturalistically, no matter what stance you have to take, because you need so much faith for each stance. Furthermore, the Jewish people who were so rigid in their law of Moses and tradition, the same laws that their ancestors had died for, had been changed almost overnight in light of Christianity. They changed the Sabbath to Sunday. They abandoned the temple sacrifices. They now held to a fully Trinitarian belief, which had been present in the Old Testament, but now was fully revealed in Jesus. This little moral teacher from Nazareth could not uproot centuries of grounded teaching and law that people laid down their lives for. Maybe an earth-shattering event that's undeniable, like, I don't know, a bodily resurrection to hundreds of people could provide proof like this or an explanation, but nothing naturalistic. The fact that they had an appealing moral compass or elevated the status of women, all good things, is not enough to explain this much devotion to just a minor crucified preacher. There has to be something greater to all of this. But I guess the little question I'm sensing on everyone else's minds is, what about the miracle claims of other religions, though? Those convinced people, right? Well, first of all, other faiths don't fundamentally rest their truth claim based on miracles, but on subjective private experiences like private revelation or nice-sounding teachings. However, Christianity is fundamentally different from every single religion in the fact that it is built off of a historical event and is falsifiable or verifiable. The central miracle of Islam is the Quran, which is apparently so linguistically and poetically perfect that no one could have authored it. However, then we get to the issue of the Islamic dilemma. The Quran, in many, many instances, confirms our scriptures, the Jewish and Christian scriptures. However, the commands and teachings in the Quran contradict the Jewish and Christian scriptures, such as Jesus only being a prophet and not the Messiah. Thus, if Christianity is false, then Islam is also false because Islam affirms the inspiration of our scriptures by Allah. And obviously, if Christianity is true, then Islam is still false. Many Muslims will counter this by saying that our scriptures have been corrupted since then and that Muhammad was reading the true gospel and Christians have got it wrong. However, this is completely untrue. We have 22,000 New Testament manuscripts that are statistically 99% consistent with one another from the 2nd century all the way up to now. We can see that our scriptures were never corrupted because we have so many copies from each century, and they're all consistent with one another. Furthermore, the revelation to Muhammad was a private experience, and if we only have one person's testimony about the encounter, it's definitely not as reliable as the public and falsifiable historical claim of the resurrection. Because the Quran describes itself as perfectly clear to understand, and if there is some secret gospel we don't know about that has been hidden from the world, then the Quran should say that because it's perfectly clear. Furthermore, Muhammad splitting the moon in half in the Hadith should have most certainly been recorded by astronomers or something of that sort, because this was witnessed by nations. It's not like the resurrection where you kind of have this thing that's happening in one place. This is something that the world could see. No one reports something like this happening. Eastern religions like Hinduism has miracle claims that gods can lift mountains or get into insane cosmic battles. However, the issue is that these are intrinsically mythological by nature and aren't grounded in any historical timeline, and they're written in a once-upon-a-time past. You can't prove it true or false. And Buddha's miracles are written hundreds of years after his death, unlike the Gospels and Epistles, which were written within the living memory of the events. Also, miracles aren't really as important to the Eastern religions because life is an illusion anyway. Verifying these miracles would be nowhere near as important as escaping the cycle of rebirth. Christianity is built on multiple attestation, and as we can see with the undesigned coincidences in the gospel and resurrection accounts, and is also proven by Luke's introduction that these are indeed accounts of eyewitnesses, it's set in a historically verifiable timeline, geography, and society, and because the resurrection was a physical miracle, it's so easy to disprove and was open to be empirically studied, while many of these other miracles aren't or fail to even fulfill the lowest of our expectations. However, some might object and say, well, if we were to expect an event like the resurrection to be true, we would have more documentation about the resurrection or Jesus' miracles from the thousands who witnessed it, affirming their truths historically. However, the first and very revealing issue in this argument is I could immediately turn it around on the skeptics and say, well, how come there's no records arguing against the resurrection that exist at the time that flat out say the resurrection is false if it's such a widespread claim? This is a clear argument from silence, but it's understandable when dealing with a supernatural event, so I'll give it a pass. Firstly, we have to understand that we cannot expect for any ancient historical event this massive pile of historical documents, because this completely disregards how ancient history worked in the first place and how fragile paper was back then. In the area of Jesus, documents would have been written with papyrus, which rots very quickly, especially in a damp and extremely hot Middle Eastern climate. You would need a text to be deemed incredibly important and copied by those if they considered them truly important if you are to expect any historical attestation to exist today on a massive scale. Furthermore, in 70 AD, the Jerusalem temple, and the entire city for that matter, was destroyed by the Roman Empire and burned the temple to the ground. Any local records of these events would have burned with the city. It is very unfortunate what we could have known, boys. Also, this is an argument you'd mostly find on the internet that most historians and scholars don't agree with, because 1 to 2 sources for a historical event is literally the standard and completely normal for the first century. Our best sources on Alexander the Great were written 300 to 400 years after his death, but the Gospels are golden in that they're written in the living memory, which also pushes the fact that these are really reliable documents. Another thing is that literacy rates in the first century Roman Empire would be around 5 to 10%. Most of every single human being, let alone impoverished Jews in the backwater province of Judea, would not know how to write or even read for that matter. Oral tradition, instead, was passed down, where memory was highly favored and utilized. Thus, the immediate response to an event like the resurrection wouldn't be to write it down, but to preach it by word of mouth. You also gotta remember that to the Roman aristocracy, Judea was just some rink-a-dink province, where crucifixion was very common. The crucifixion of a Jewish carpenter wouldn't have even made the lunchroom chatter. Roman and Jewish historians like Josephus and Tacitus didn't write about Jesus decades later until he became a problem to Rome, which is impressive that there is any writing at all about this Jewish civilian who wasn't even a ruler. Also, writing was so expensive back then, and you could not expect the early Christians, who were dominated by the lower class, to have the same financial access to writing, tools, or scribes that could copy these things down. Religiously speaking, the Pharisees and Sadducees saw Jesus as a blasphemer, and Rome saw him as a revolutionary and essentially charged him with sedition. Also, we shouldn't expect that any of the Jews or Romans are going to write about this at the time, because why in the HE double hockey sticks would the opposition write a document that confirms the claims of the enemy they have spent years trying to bring down? They do not want to immortalize the Christian faith in any way, so they most certainly aren't going to write down these claims or acts. But come on, is that really all the evidence? There's gotta be more. Well, don't worry, this might make some of you roll your eyes, but I think it's something to be examined and something we can't just leave out of the equation. I'm gonna say it, the Shroud of Turin. I know, wasn't this thing debunked? Well, no, and we'll get to that. I know this is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So let's just take a look at this thingy-mabob. So the Shroud of Turin is a 14-foot herringbone weave linen cloth which bears a faint image of a bloodied man with marks consistent to ancient practices of crucifixion and scourging. This image is double-sided with a frontal and dorsal image of the figure. And the wounds on the head, the marks of scourging and crucifixion, the likeness to popular depictions, and the odd and seemingly miraculous nature of the image, many assume this to be the literal burial cloth of Jesus Christ, seamlessly capturing the moment of his resurrection. Understandably, upon first glance, most people would assume this to be some kind of clever artistry, but it gets more complicated than that when we get into the fine details and anomalous nature of the image itself. In 1898, a photographer named Secondo Pia was granted permission to photograph the Shroud of Turin for an upcoming Shroud exhibition. Pia takes a picture of the face image of the Shroud and takes it into the darkroom to develop when he realizes the image is a photographic negative. It was from this point where all of the public curiosity about the nature of the Shroud truly exploded and now became a scientific matter. This photo turned what seemed like just another piece of medieval art, a very mysterious relic that demands professional scrutiny. How could a medieval artist create a photographic negative before photography even existed? For a while, Pia was actually condemned by critics for tampering with the photograph, but eventually, despite these criticisms, the image garnered enough attention from the scientific lobby, and they accepted Pia's photograph as authentic to the image of the Shroud. There was also skepticism to the Shroud's authenticity due to medieval church documents that claim the image was faked by church officials in order to gain a profit. We'll address this counter-argument later, but hold on to that for now. Debate persisted pretty heavily up until 1978. The Shroud of Turin research project was organized by a team of American scientists from different backgrounds, atheist, agnostic, and religious. In October of 1978, they spent 5 days in Turin, Italy, examining the cloth using modern scientific instruments such as X-ray fluorescent technology, infrared spectroscopy, and UV photography in order to figure out what exactly this thing was. STURP is the most thorough, peer-reviewed scientific examination that the Shroud of Turin has ever been through. However, instead of solving the mystery definitively of what the Shroud was, it actually made it much more complicated than before. After 5 days of testing, the main conclusions from STURP were this. The absence of pigments, as revealed by the X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, and also microscopic examination. There were no paints, pigments, dyes, or chemical binders that could keep the image on the cloth for so long. The image is superficial. Microscopic examination concluded that the image on the cloth is only present on the uppermost fibrils of the linen cloth. It only penetrates 0.2 microns deep and is thinner than a human hair. If a paint or dye was used to create the image, you would expect a deeper penetration than Forensic analysis concluded the presence of type AB blood containing hemoglobin, bilirubin, and serum albumin, and even show post-mortem blood clotting. Specifically, the bilirubin concentration is exceedingly high, which is consistent with the blood of murder victims who were under severe physical trauma. This is also one of the other reasons why the color has a more reddish tone rather than a brownish tone that's present in most aged bloodstains, because the high presence of these chemicals discolors the blood in this way. The presence of blood was before the image. After an analysis of how the blood interacts and is positioned in accordance with the image, it was discovered that the blood was present before the image was even formed, because there's no body image present under the bloodstains. The image is three-dimensional. After analysis with the VP8 image analyzer, a tool which NASA has used to map out the topography on planets and moons, the STURP team discovered that the image on the Shroud depicts an accurate correlation with a three-dimensional structure of a human body, which isn't usually found in mere paintings. In order to assess the scientific reality of this project, we're going to examine counter-arguments against the nature of the project and how it was conducted. The project was just biased. Investigator and denier of the Shroud's authenticity, Joe Nickel, had objected that the project was biased because many of its members were linked to a religious group known as the Holy Shroud Guild. Thus, the objection is that this was a dishonest project organized by a bunch of religious fanatics in order to try to make religion seem true instead of seeking empirical truth. This is fundamentally wrong on every level and completely disregards the thorough process of peer reviewing and the fact that these aren't just unsupported claims that are made with no evidence. The STURP team literally provided us with the data and showed us how they came to these conclusions using modern testing equipment. Another problem is that the team was pretty diverse, consisting of 33 members of well-credentialed scientists from prestigious scientific institutions such as the Los Alamos National Laboratory, the U.S. Air Force Academy, etc. The team included atheists, agnostics, Jews, and Christians, and was simply trying to seek the truth behind this mysterious relic. Even if the shroud isn't real, it doesn't undermine the Christian claim in any way. Furthermore, Stirp's conclusions were not self-published in some fringe religious magazine, but were given the standard method of scientific approval as all other studies do, and their findings were published in peer-reviewed scientific journals that were considered top of the line at the time they were published. Thus, the validity of the conclusions do not reside with the personal beliefs of the researchers, but the raw data that was acquired during the tests. The shroud was actually just a medieval painting. A new challenge to the findings of the Stirp team was a response from microscopist Walter McCrone, who had actually done some work for the team briefly. He scrutinized sticky tape samples of the chemical composition of the shroud and claimed that the image was actually a medieval painting created using iron oxide pigment, which would be binded onto the cloth by a gelatin medium. McCrone was the only original member of Stirp who objected to the findings. The first people who refuted McCrone's study were the biophysicist John Heller and the chemist Alan Adler, members of the Stirp team who reproduced the same results from Stirp using X-ray fluorescence and spectroscopy to conclude that the iron he was seeing on the cloth was randomly distributed, but not an element present in the body image. The only place the two were able to find iron of that kind of concentration on the cloth was in the bloodstains. The pair found absolutely zero evidence of any gelatin or collagen or any possible binding in the image area that could have made such a thin image stay on the cloth for so long. You have to remember the results of Stirp. The image is extremely superficial and penetrates only 0.2 microns deep. Thus, if any binder had been used to make the image stay on there, it would cause any paint used to seep deep into the fibers of the linen, which isn't the case. The bloodstains are too red to be real blood. Another objection to the results of Stirp is that the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin are way too red to be considered real blood, because when blood oxidizes, it usually leaves a dark brown or black color over many ages of this process. Thus, the blood was likely painted on using some kind of synthetic paint mixture rather than it being real blood. Again, Stirp and multiple future forensic studies undeniably prove the presence of real human blood in the areas where blood is present on the cloth, and thankfully the advent of modern forensic science can explain why the color is this way pretty easily. The red color of the blood is not anomalous nor some undocumented issue. It's actually a pretty well-known phenomenon in forensic science and actually helps the Shroud's case a lot. In a situation where the human body goes through severe trauma or shock, as it would be in the case of a man scourged and crucified, the liver will release a lot of bilirubin into the bloodstream, and blood with a high concentration of bilirubin will stay red and not undergo the same blood oxidation in which it browns over time. Furthermore, modern forensic studies which have re-examined the findings of Stirp have also detected small particles of creatinine bound to the blood particles on the shroud. This is a highly specific and microscopic binding of particles that reflects the chemical composition of a victim who has undergone severe physical trauma. There is no way a medieval artist could have synthesized something like this. The carbon dating clearly disproves the shroud. Okay, it's time to get into everyone's favorite objection to the Shroud of Turin, the 1988 carbon dating, which seemed to have definitely destroyed any implication of the shroud's authenticity, dating it clearly to 1260 to 1390. Unfortunately, though, modern science has proven that this carbon dating is invalid and no longer sustainable as an objection to the shroud's authenticity. Stirp scientist Ray Rogers had published a peer-reviewed scientific article showing that the carbon dating sample was actually taken from a highly contaminated corner of the Shroud of Turin that had actually been repaired in the Middle Ages. In the sample area, Rogers had discovered cotton fibers and a plant dye that are completely absent from the shroud's main body area. Rogers also examined the concentration of vanillin on the cloth, which is a compound in linen cloths and the shroud's linen cloth that decays over time and can give us a pretty good idea of how old the shroud is. Because the decay of vanillin has a pretty long and drawn out process, and the fact that the main body has zero vanillin contained in the cloth, this suggests that the shroud is between 1300 to 3000 years old. The carbon dating sample, however, contained vanillin, which shows that the sample was of a different chemical composition and most likely younger than the main cloth which contains the image. Finally, in 2017, the raw data, which had gone unpublished for years by the way, was finally released by the British Museum after refusal to do so for a long time. It finally ended any debate over the authenticity of the carbon dating because it clearly shows that the results are fundamentally flawed mathematically and prove that the samples were taken from contaminated portions of the cloth. Therefore, the carbon dating of the cloth cannot be scientifically sustainable any longer. Now, we're going to look at how the skeptical front of the Shroud of Turin debate fundamentally misunderstands the composition of the cloth and look at their counter-arguments for how a medieval forger could have created this. However, before we get into any of that, we first need to Thanos snap this one objection out of existence, that herringbone weave linen didn't even exist during the time of Christ or just wasn't in his area. This is a pretty odd objection. However, I have seen it genuinely utilized in Shroud debates, that the fact that the Shroud's linen cloth is composed of herringbone weave, which they argue makes no sense for a 1st century Galilean linen cloth, especially for someone who is not part of the aristocracy. Well, the earthly aristocracy, at least. We also, according to them, have found no records of herringbone weave existing in 1st century Judea. Therefore, this cannot be the true burial cloth of Jesus. The idea that herringbone weave was some later invention and we cannot find any evidence prior to Jesus' time is a complete historical falsehood. Complete falsehood. We have excavated herringbone and complex weaves which date back 800 years before the life of Jesus Christ, such as the Hallstatt textiles. Furthermore, during Jesus' time, complex weaves were in wide circulation in the Mediterranean area, and we have found fabrics of this kind in Middle Eastern cities like Palmyra and Dur Europos from the 3rd century. We also have found complex weaves in Kent dating back to 250 AD. Thus, the skill to weave such things most definitely existed during the time of Christ. However, what makes this counter-argument fall apart even harder is the fact that the Shroud actually does mirror 1st century Judean textiles. In 2002, a Swiss expert of textiles, Mechtilde Fleury-Lemberg, had done a restoration of the Shroud of Turin in 2002 due to its extensive damage from past fires. During her restoration, she realized that the weave is almost identical to a 1st century textile which had been recovered from Masada, which was a Jewish fortress that had been besieged by the Roman armies. The Shroud's design is what we'd expect for a 1st century linen cloth, rather than a later European design methodology. Furthermore, the person who got Jesus' linen cloth was a rich member of the aristocracy, the Jewish Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea, so it would make sense that this has a more complex weave if Joseph of Arimathea is likely raking in more cash than most people would be at that time. The image is just a medieval bas-relief. The main and common objection you'll hear nowadays is that the artist of the Shroud had draped a wet linen cloth over a bas-relief sculpture of a man and rubbed the cloth with pigments to create the image. Now, this method can produce a negative image. However, it fails on every other front. Firstly, there's the problem of anatomical distortion. If you have a 2D linen cloth, which is draped over a 3D bas-relief, flattening the cloth upon it and rubbing will cause facial distortion, and the face will look super wide and odd. The image of the Shroud lacks this effect, and appears to be projected straight up and down, which is impossible to get by merely rubbing on a 3D surface. This is also refuted by Stirp, which concluded that the image is 0.2 microns deep. Rubbing a pigment into linen would most certainly make the particles penetrate deep into the fibers of the cloth through the pressure being exerted through the rubbing. The fibers beneath the Shroud image are completely discolored, so there's clearly no pressure being used to apply the image artistically. Furthermore, with a rubbing, you would see traces and strokes of the artist's work, which is also not present on the Shroud microscopically. It's as if the image was printed on in a single instant. The image was scorched onto the cloth. Another common hypothesis is that the Shroud was placed on a heated bas-relief and it just slightly scorched the image to create a light brown colored negative image. Again, this can explain the negative and the color, but everything else falls apart here. Firstly, we know the Shroud has survived multiple fires, and we still have scorch marks on the cloth from those fires. Scorch marks under fluorescent lighting will have a distinct fluorescence to them that is not at all present in the body image. If the image were scorching, it would share the same chemical composition or fluorescence of the scorch marks from the fire, which it doesn't. Again, we also have to address the problem that the image is literally thinner than a human hair. If heat like that were applied to linen, it would most definitely penetrate the threads, but again, that's not how the image works on the shroud. Every single microscopic colored fiber of the body image of the shroud is the exact same shade of brown and the exact same depth. For example, on the nose of the man of the shroud, you can see that this is a darker area, but they aren't darker fibers, but they simply just have a larger concentration of colored fibers alongside more spread out uncolored ones. A heated statue could not replicate an effect of this kind. It's just some form of medieval photography. An art historian named Nicholas Allen claims that a very smart medieval artist had somehow invented some version of medieval photography. The artist used a method called camera obscura, a quartz lens, and a cloth that would be covered in silver nitrate that is light sensitive and therefore an image can be printed onto it. Thus, the artist exposed the cloth to a corpse or statue in the sun for a week or so to print the image on the cloth. Firstly, there's absolutely zero scientific or historical evidence of this kind of technology existing in the Middle Ages. Furthermore, Stirp concluded in their tests with X-ray fluorescence and mass spectrometry that there is no silver, iodine, or any chemicals that could be implicated in some proto-photographic innovation. The final problem is that a photograph needs light rays to reflect off of an object. This casts shadows and would exhibit some form of directional lighting that's not at all present on the shroud image because there's no cast shadows. It wasn't that something was reflecting light and putting the image on the shroud, but the concentration of the image correlates to the distance that the burial cloth was from Jesus' body. The dust transfer technique and the Maillard reaction. Instead of going on the view of total forgery, some researchers have opted to utilize a purely naturalistic explanation for the body image. Ray Rogers, a key defender of the shroud's superficial image, bloodstains, and unique nature, is also skeptical that it's totally miraculous and has suggested that the image was caused by amine gases from the corpse that reacted with the residue on the cloth, such as soap used to wash the cloth on the surface of the linen, or some even say that it's an imprint of biological dust, and some will just say that maybe it might be a reaction with the burial spices or something like that. It is plausible, but still, like every single shroud counter-argument, cannot check all of the boxes and fully explain the odd nature of this image. First of all, when bodily gases diffuse, they just go randomly in many different directions and don't have a strict path. Thus, the cloth would have a very blurred and obscured image, but the shroud is a very high-resolution image in which you can distinguish all the anatomical features of the man. Thus, gas cannot suffice for the high-resolution nature of this image. Furthermore, for something like the Maillard reaction to create any distinct image or residue, the body would need to remain in the cloth long enough to produce any significant gases that correlate with bodily decay. Medical and forensic scientists note that there is indeed a complete absence of decompositionary fluids that would accompany any gases that signal decay. We know biblically that Jesus was dead for 3 days and not in the cloth for that long, and also if we were to expect to inhabit this physical body again, it probably would be preserved from rot or decay. The bloodstains are imperfect. A few forensic scientists have claimed that the bloodstains on the shroud do not accurately represent the blood flows of a crucifixion victim. However, forensic pathologists, medical scientists, and hematologists have clearly showed the flawed nature of these experiments. In 2018, two skeptical scientists, Matteo Barini and Luigi Garlaschelli, had used a cannula hooked to a volunteer and grabbed a plastic mannequin to make an accurate simulation of the blood flow from a crucifixion wound. On the shroud, there are kind of zigzaggy, crisscrossy blood flows, and because their static model couldn't replicate the flows, they concluded the shroud is a fake. The fatal flaw that completely dismantles this experiment is the assumption that a crucifixion victim is remaining completely static. This is objectively false in every sense. A former chief medical examiner named Dr. Frederick Zugaby had spent many years performing experiments on volunteers strapped to a cross to demonstrate that crucifixion was a very tormenting and dynamic process. To prevent any asphyxiation, the victim would have to push up on his nailed feet to draw a little tiny breath and then slump back down again, and would have to do this repeatedly. Sugaby observed that the constant up and down motion shifts the angles of the arms between 55 to 65 degree angles, and this perfectly explains why the blood on the shroud are zigzaggy and branch outwards at different angles rather than a single straight, mathematically perfect line. No torture this cruel and violent and dynamic is ever going to be that simple or not messy. It should be pretty self-evident to anybody that a static mannequin isn't going to bleed like a suffocating and constantly moving crucifixion victim. The blood is too neat. Many Shroud skeptics have pointed out that if you were to wrap a bleeding body in a linen cloth, the stains would be these smeared, indistinguishable blotches rather than these distinct and well-defined smears. This helps to support the skeptical theory that artists merely painted the stains on rather than it actually being wrapped around the body. I was actually relieved while researching this video to see that an actually solid counter-argument was formed, but unfortunately it's very much not true, but definitely sounds very plausible compared to a lot of the other stuff I'm talking about. Forensically speaking, this completely misunderstands how the blood was transferred. The cloth was not wrapped around a still bleeding man, but a dead man whose blood was already coagulated. Again, this was not only proven by Sturp, but also by the biophysicist and chemist Heller and Adler, which proved the bloodstains are transfers from intact blood clots. We also have to observe the circumstances. Jesus is transferred from the warm outside to a very cool and humid rock tomb. Thus, the moisture or any spices used for burial would cause fibrinolysis. The body would essentially temporarily reliquefy the surface of these dried blood clots, just enough to transfer a clean imprint to the cloth. Another major issue is the problem of the serum rings. If you look at the blood on the shroud under UV lighting, you can see that the bloodstains are surrounded by these fluorescent rings. Forensic hematologists have shown that when blood clots are retracted upon human skin, it discharges serum around the edges of the blood. Thus, the presence of these rings definitely disqualifies any medieval forger who couldn't have known to fake anything like that because of the fact that they're invisible to the naked eye. The blood pool on the dorsal image. On the dorsal image of the shroud, Barini and Garlaskelli had noticed that there is a large concentration of pooled blood across the lower back of the shroud man. So they trickled this fake blood down the body of the mannequin and found that it didn't actually pool in this area naturally during crucifixion. However, again, this completely disregards the post-mortem transportation of the man. Pathologist Dr. Robert Buckland found that a spear thrust to the right side had pierced the pleura and the right atrium of the heart, which had discharged blood mixed with pericardial fluid. Henceforth, when the body was taken off of the cross and laid on its back, the remaining blood and fluid would flow down the side of the torso and pool across the lower back. This is exactly where the linen would be resting against the man. There is no way the bloodstains are the result of any artwork. Universally, literally every medieval painting of Jesus depicts him nailed through the center of the palms. However, the shroud accurately shows that the nail wound is in the wrist, in destot space, and not the center of the palm. The surgeon Dr. Pierre Barbet had proven that if you had nailed a victim through the center of the palm, it couldn't fully support the body and would tear through the hand. However, if you nail through the wrist, you can still have that structural support. Another highly accurate detail is, ironically, the shroud man's missing thumbs. Well, you can kind of see one of them here. Only 4 fingers are really visible, and neurophysiology has shown that if you have a nail driven through destot space, this would heavily damage the median nerve, which causes partial paralysis in the hand muscles, which leads to the thumbs snapping into the palms. The final objection we're going to talk about is the medieval documents that quote-unquote debunk the shroud's authenticity. 2 documents from the 14th century known as the D'Arc Memorandum and Nicole Erasmi's Problemata. Firstly, let's look at the documents. The Memorandum was written by Pierre D'Arc, who was the Bishop of Troyes to the anti-pope Clement VII. He claimed that church officials who had preceded his see had done an investigation into the nature of the shroud and discovered that it was in fact a fraud who painted it to grab money from religious pilgrims. The second document, the Problemata, claims that the shroud is a clerical deception as well. So, does this mean the shroud is done for? No, not even a little. Firstly, I can totally understand before the modern scientific discoveries of the shroud why someone would think that this is just some elaborate painting, because if you don't see the negative image or know anything about the blood or the nature of the image, well, you'd never think it to be a photograph that has many signatures of authenticity. Secondly, in light of all this objective scientific evidence, I really don't think that the claims of a 14th century bishop is really a smoking gun against all this. What do scholars think about this, though? Well, in the memorandum, the bishop had claimed that the artist had made a confession to painting the shroud, but there's no record of this claim to back up any investigation made by the church inquiring such a popular and widely known cloth. For now, it's really only hearsay. Also, we have to acknowledge that in the Middle Ages, many fake relics were made, and the exhibition of the shroud was drawing pilgrims from all over the land, and, well, the pre-Reformation church happily asked for quote-unquote donations. I'm Catholic, and I'm allowed to make that joke. Who knows, this could genuinely just be some jealous anger towards the fact that this thing was making big bucks. He's probably losing lots of that revenue from his church, which was right by where this exhibition was happening. Furthermore, this document isn't even signed, and it's a draft. It's debated whether this was ever even sent to Clement. While the anti-pope made a declaration that the cloth was just a representation of Christ's cloth and not the real deal, we don't even know if the bishop's letter was ever sent, and also we know that the claim it was painted contradicts scientific discovery, which I take over some historical claim that has no supporting reliability. Furthermore, even then, we know for a fact the shroud was not from the Middle Ages because of the Sudarium of Oviedo, which we have mentioned historically way before the Middle Ages, and was the face cloth of Jesus put onto his face when he was buried. The blood on the Sudarium and the face of the shroud match so perfectly together with over 100 points of contact that it's definitely no coincidence. So let's get this straight. Here's what a medieval forger would have to know how to do. He'd have to check all of these boxes to get this image perfect. He has to know how to make a photographic negative coupled with a three-dimensional image, a perfect negative that is high resolution and gets all the shadows of the body right. The poor guy wouldn't have been able to take a picture and check his work. He would have to know how to get the image on the cloth without any signs of directionality or artistic application. No paint, no dyes, no scorching, not a thing. He would have to know how to get this image to penetrate on the uppermost fibrils without letting any of his tools of artistry seep into the cloth. He would have to know about destot space and the anatomical perfection of the thumbs retracting, things that weren't scientifically known until the 20th century. He would have to know that the Romans used a flagrum to flog their victims because the wounds on the shroud are consistent with an ancient flagrum and arrange the blood in such a way that it matches the wounds from this tool perfectly. He would have to acquire the blood of a trauma victim and apply the blood on before creating the image, since there's no image present under the bloodstains. He would have to know that Jesus would not have historically worn a neat crown of thorns like in medieval depictions, but a messy bunch of thorns that looks more like a cap. He would have to know how to apply invisible serum rings to the cloth, which can only be made present when blood clots retract on human skin, and UV light had not even been discovered until 1801 to view such things. He would have to know that a trauma victim's blood with a high concentration of bilirubin would be light red, not dark brown when painted. He would have to know how to add all the chemical composites of blood into the blood parts of the cloth and somehow intricately pick up microscopic particles with tweezers and place them in these areas. He would also have to know how to preserve such a thin image without any chemical binder that could cause the image to remain for so long. He's also painting Jesus naked, which in the Middle Ages was almost never done. This is consistent with ancient crucifixion in that victims would be crucified completely naked, but Jesus had almost never been depicted in this way. Finally, he would have to know how to accurately exhibit the side wounds, chemical composition of the blood and cardiac fluid, and also the perfect forensic pooling and trailing of the blood of a crucifixion victim. Furthermore, he'd be painting an extremely brutal depiction of this crucifixion, which was universally never depicted as this grotesque. However, this offers a pretty notable historical reality in that Jesus was beaten to the point of unrecognizability and offers an accurate look into the cruelty of the Roman Empire and its punishments. He'd also have to know how blood would form upon a cloth in a short window because the blood and body was evidently not in contact with the cloth for very long, fitting with the biblical narrative that something happened that separated him from this cloth. If we can't even replicate all the attributes of this image today, how are we going to expect a medieval friar to do? However, this is not the end of strange miracles in association with Christianity. Let's take a look at the next one, which really helps the authenticity of Christianity's claims. As a former agnostic, one of the biggest proponents for coming to understand and eventually fully convert to theism was the first cause argument for God's existence. The idea being that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe had a beginning and cannot have merely come from non-existence or nothing. Therefore, the universe had a cause, which we would understand to be God. However, it is that final premise that is controversial, the idea that it is God who is the first cause. Is it far-fetched or even fallacious to say such a thing? Well, we're going to observe the greatest counter-arguments to the first cause in order to deepen our understanding of the reality of God and his creation. In being fair to the opposing side, I will list the main and most convincing counter-arguments to the first cause, which stem from multiple points of logic that oppose certain and multiple premises of the argument at once. Objection 1. The first cause does not have to be God. To say the first cause is God would be to commit a God of the gaps fallacy, in which we place God in the seat of unexplained phenomena. Therefore, God is not a sufficient first cause. Addressing that counter-argument that to place God in an area of unexplained phenomena is a God of the gaps fallacy is completely true and something I agree with. We should not be as ignorant as to say that every odd occurrence or coincidence is merely God, albeit without any good reason or motives of credibility to justify that position. However, foundationally, this argument conflates observational data with ontological metaphysics. When an apologist argues the first cause, they're not seeking out a gap in unexplained reality, but rather trying to come to a rational understanding of the nature of reality per se. Scientifically and philosophically, we can come to a confident notion that space, time, and matter did not exist before the universe, meaning that the proponents of the cause would have to be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, which is how classical theism has always defined the nature of God. God is not an object or physical property in the universe that causes certain events to arise. His very essence is his existence, because of the very fact that he was all that was before. He is not separate from his existence, or that his existence is inside him or around him. He just is the standard of existence, logic, consciousness, morality, and the fabric of reality itself. Furthermore, because we know of the universe's infinite expansion, it is difficult to justify how a finite, illogically ordered process like chance or any other commonly used naturalistic explanation can create an infinite and continuing process, because it does not possess the infinite power to create infinite and logically ordered reality in the first place. Therefore, we can come to understand that the proponent of creation is one of infinite power. Reality in itself is tangible and able to be studied empirically due to the philosophical presupposition that is self-evident to all people that the universe is ordered, tangible, and its concepts can be deduced from reason. This is a fact we would not expect to understand or even have a conscious conclusion of without a tangible, sensible, and logical creator who not only gives us this logic, but leaves footprints of his identity as logic itself throughout creation and its order, and in the very fact that we can do scientific study in the first place. Consciousness also is a great issue when dealing with this objection, because it cannot be easily concluded that consciousness itself can come from an otherwise unconscious concept or being that is creating all things. Even deeper, an unconscious being or process could not see past its own unconsciousness and realize that it can create consciousness, because then it would be conscious. It is quite the same with saying that it is by blind chance that all things are created, because we know reality and existence to be tangible, empirically observable, ordered with laws that keep it existing and free from chaotic reality-defying events that tear the fabric completely. It is almost completely unlikely that a blind, unordered, unconscious process can create ordered processes and secondary causes like evolution, existence, consciousness, laws, and consistent non-contradictory elements in the universe that don't cause it to completely fall apart. Thus, if there was only nothing or chance or some other commonly utilized naturalistic explanation that created the universe, if the properties that chance or a blind process has to create the universe is spaceless, timeless, immaterial reality, then it couldn't even create a universe containing space, time, and matter in the first place. Also, the universe is a contingent being. It is a thing that can exist or cannot exist. The universe has a possibility to not exist, yet it does, in the same way that people, art pieces, movies, shows, and books have a possibility not to exist. Furthermore, the universe is properly ordered from the beginning to sustain itself without chaos ensuing, and is ordered in such an exact way that it can hold reality and existence together without fracturing. It is highly improbable that such conditions can arise from mere chance, as one could argue a multiverse, which makes the first cause issue an even more difficult one, because now you have to explain what cause is generating these multiverses. It does not solve the problem, but jumbles the logic up even more. As it would be with human art, we tend to see that the greatest proof that the artist exists is not contained within the art itself, but the fact that there is art to begin with. There is an existence in the first place. Thus, when we use the first cause argument, our goal is not to try and fill an odd and scientifically challenging gap in understanding, but is a realization of the ontological foundations of existence itself, which is ordered to sustainability. The second objection states that we cannot make an application of universal realities to extra-universal realities. It could very well be that, logically speaking, the same concept of creation does not apply outside of space, time, and matter as it would within. Therefore, God is not sufficient to be the first cause. However, this counter-argument conflates physics with logic, and pertaining to epistemology is self-contradictory. The idea is the causal principles may not be the same outside of the universe as it would be inside the universe, where causal principles are required. Yet it fundamentally misunderstands the fact that causality or creation is not a physical law or property, as it would be with thermodynamics or gravity, which only bears its applications within the universe itself and is not present outside of it. These laws are principles within being, while causality is the principle of being itself. Furthermore, the very fact that we know scientifically the universe began in the first place shows within itself that the same standard of causality exists outside of the universe as it does inside. As we addressed earlier, nothing cannot create everything. Thus, a causal factor created the universe, just as causal factors create flowers or life. It has the same application to the beginning as it would be in the present fabric of existence. So in the very fact that we have been caused and effects have been made because of the cause shows that the same principle and idea applies to whatever process or being was outside of the universe, albeit these effects that came from the beginning of the universe are not natural, uncontrolled effects, but evidently controlled and ordered effects, which also shows that an ordered level and understanding of how existence should have ordered causes and effects, which are non-contradictory and hold together the fabric of existence, also pre-exist before creation. The very fact that any process or being has a thought process or idea of how the universe should be ordered so that it can exist and not fall apart upon the creation event shows us that the same standard of effective cause and effect existed in the sense that it existed as an idea. Thus, the standard is still present in pre-existent reality. However, one could argue further that if this same concept still exists, why not with God? We will address that later, but hang on to that, because that is a good point and key to understanding this. The third objection goes as follows. God is perfect and unchanging. Thus, why would God have any reason or motive to create the universe if he is already in a state of absolute perfection? Creating a changing universe would meddle with that state of perfection. Therefore, God is not a sufficient first cause. The foundations of this argument are lacking in the very fact that it humanizes God and makes the presupposition that God is merely acting out of psychological necessity or a lack of something as human beings would otherwise act. However, creation makes complete sense if we are to assume that the God of classical theism is the first cause of all things. Yes, it is true, God cannot acquiesce anything because God is everything and lacks nothing. Humans, on the other hand, want to acquire things out of the lack thereof. The brunt of the objection, essentially, is that God is not infinite because he needs to create a universe to acquire a lack of something he doesn't already possess in his pre-universal state of perfection. However, this presupposes that God needed to create the universe in the first place, because he very much did not need to create the universe, because like humans and properties within the universe had a beginning and had a chance to not exist at all. It is contingent. However, we can see in the very act of creation the doctrine of God's infinite goodness is expressed in the very fact that he would create the universe in the first place. The infinitely expanding universe reflects the infinite love of God pouring out to all people. That fact that he loves and is so good that he would not hoard perfection all to himself out of greed, but create humans in his image and incarnate onto earth so that he may resonate with the suffering and grief of humans, so that they may not be alone, and most importantly, so that they can share in that perfection with him. Nothing is a greater reflection of God's infinite goodness and love than that. Furthermore, creating a changing universe does not meddle with or alter God's perfection or immutability in any way, because the universe is not mixed with God, nor does it add anything to him, but is an external and separate reality, an infinite universe that reflects his infinite love and goodness. In the same way that an author does not lose any of their skill or change any of their hardwired components of their nature when they write a new book, so does God, because the universe is not God, but a reflection of himself. Ironically, the very fact that any concept of change exists at all in the fabric of reality and doesn't lead to destruction shows that there is an unchanging order in place to keep change balanced but always working. However, it works in such a way that the universe is preserved and does not fracture. The very fact that we can see change working in reality and movement still happening and existence continuing despite the change is a greater testament to God's providence than if it were not the case. Furthermore, creation could not be immutable because it would just be God. There cannot be one attribute of God that exists in reality without all the others simultaneously, because infinite and complete immutability, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence all rely on one another to exist. Thus, you cannot have a perfectly unchanging universe without it just being God. It needs to possess actuality and potentiality. If the universe is expected to exist as a created and finite concept, then it intrinsically would have to have the concept of change written into it. Also to note, when I say finite concept, that is not rejecting the fact that the universe is in a state of infinite expansion, but is to say that the universe will never reach a point of completion because there is no stopping point to its expansion. In a certain sense, it is finite and constantly changing. On the other hand, God is complete infinity and completely unchanging because he is already complete, while the universe isn't. The fourth objection goes as follows. In quantum mechanics, virtual particles that exist and cease to exist in and out of reality do not have any form of detectable cause. Thus, to say that anything that begins to exist has a cause is a shaky premise, because we have proven that some things can begin to exist without a cause. Therefore, God is not a sufficient first cause. I listed this argument because it sounds very convincing and put together in a very uniform and seemingly empirical manner, because it lists scientific evidence for why the first cause is an impossibility. However, this is not the case when the evidence being listed is an inaccurate understanding of how virtual particles even work and what the first cause aims to show. The main issue that causes the argument to completely fall apart is its incomplete understanding of virtual particles. When we say that God created all things from nothing, we mean absolute non-being. Yet virtual particles do not appear from absolute non-being, but from the quantum vacuum, which is a tangible, ordered, and active fluctuation of energy that actually has laws that govern the process. Thus, virtual particles do not pop into existence from absolute non-being, but from the quantum vacuum, which is the exact opposite. Therefore, this objection is completely insufficient on scientific grounds. The fifth objection goes as follows. If everything that begins to exist needs a cause, then what is the cause of God? The logic is hypocritical, and the premise contradicts itself. Therefore, God is not an efficient first cause because he himself would need a cause by this logic. This argument is one of the most common counter-arguments you see from skeptics, especially on the internet, which is disappointing because if you had just read and comprehended the actual premise more carefully, you would see how this conclusion is nonsensical. The premise reads that everything that begins to exist has a cause, contingent things that can begin to exist or have a chance to not exist. If we were attempting to argue that every single thing has a cause, then the objection would be completely correct. However, we are speaking of contingent agents, not every agent, including the primary agent, which is God. God is the necessary being that allows any tangible concept or room for existence in the first place to be remotely formulated. Furthermore, there can be no creator of God, or the creator of God, because this would lead to infinite regression, which is logically impossible. Something has to be unnecessary and uncaused, even if you don't believe it's God. There has to be a necessary and uncaused foundation to all things, whether you believe it to be the universe itself or another factor. Is it hard to comprehend? Yes. However, to say that because it's hard to comprehend it cannot be true is inherently fallacious and would be hard for many to be convinced by on its own. The sixth objection goes as follows. Before the universe began, God was not a creator, but when he created the universe, he became one. If we are to assume that God is immutable, then how can we justify the theology of God's immutability with the very act of creation itself? Therefore, God is not a sufficient first cause. Again, the objection sounds good, but ignores a fundamental fact about reality before the universe. The very fact that there was no time in the first place. There was no time where God was not the creator because, well, there just was no time in the first place. Time is merely the measurement of change throughout the universe. God exists in an endless present where there is no before or future, but simply acts instantaneously in this endless present in forms, time, space, and matter. He wasn't just waiting around to create, but created in that single instantaneous present. However, even then, God's act of creation is one unchanging act in and of itself. However, it is the effects produced from that one act that are changing. Being the creator is not an intrinsic change within God, but a relational change. It does not at all contradict with God's immutability. The seventh and final objection goes as follows. Newton's first law of thermodynamics clearly states that within an isolated system, energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only change forms. The universe is an isolated system, and the amount of energy has to be constant. However, the first cause argument claims that God created energy out of nothingness. Therefore, the theology is scientifically impossible, and God is not a sufficient first cause. This objection is one of my favorites of the first cause, because again, it uses an empirical piece of data to show that this is false. So there's an actual uniformity and sensibility to this argument, which makes it so favorable in my eyes if you're attempting to argue for a position like atheism. It's what I would probably use if I were in that position. But despite that fact, it is still extremely problematic. It severely conflates the rules of reality with the creation of the rules themselves. The first law of thermodynamics posits a law of physical change. It is showing how energy acts once it has begun to exist. Again, God has not taken pre-existent matter and turned it into the universe. This would make God an editor and not the author. Absolute creation ex nihilo does not in any way, shape, and form contradict the first law, because the law only applies to existent energy that is present in reality, but it is not trying to explain how energy itself comes to exist in the first place, but shows that once it does, it cannot be created or destroyed. Those are the main, and in my opinion, most convincing objections. However, if you want to see more about this, please let me know, and Lord Jesus Christ be with you. Amen.